Hey everybody, Nate here from WASD20. Welcome to the dungeon. This is the first in a new series on how to create dungeons for your tabletop role-playing games. I've been asked for over a year now, over and over again, you've got your mapping videos, but when are you going to show us how you map dungeons? And finally in this series I'm going to be addressing that question and getting into it. Here in part 1, however, we're mostly going to be doing the planning phase for dungeons. So here in the planning phase, we're first off going to be answering the question, what is a dungeon? Then we'll start looking at, okay, how do you actually use them to good effect in your tabletop role-playing games? What role can dungeons play? And lastly, we'll be kind of asking those questions, okay, now how do I actually go about getting ideas to create my own dungeon? So that's going to be it for part 1, and then in part 2, we'll actually put pencil to paper and start mapping the thing. So firstly, what is a dungeon? Now, if we're going to take it in its literal sense, a dungeon is an underground prison, right? These were common in castles, and sometimes it could just be one big old cell in the basement of a castle where they kept a couple prisoners. But obviously, we want to take things a little bit further, and when most people talk about dungeons today, especially in the context of a fantasy role-playing game, we're not talking just about that. We're talking about much more than that. Essentially, a dungeon is a series of rooms that are connected and self-contained. So this containment could be in the form of walls and very solid, immovable things, but sometimes it could be other barriers. It could be lava, maybe, or it could be a dangerous ravine, or it could be just a very painful thicket. So there's all sorts of things that can create barriers to create closed-in spaces. But essentially, a dungeon is usually something that's a series of rooms, connected and self-contained. Now let's take a moment to talk about how a dungeon fits into a role-playing game and how it might fit into a sort of an ongoing campaign. A dungeon, especially if you have sort of an open sandbox of a world for your players to explore, and you have a game that's based on a lot of player agency and player choice, which are all really good things, a dungeon in some ways can be an opportunity for you to take a break from the big open, you have all these choices and where do you want to go, you're in a big city, you're in a big world, and it can be a chance for you to kind of focus on a smaller area because it is more enclosed, and that really does enable you to lovingly, we'll say, craft something specifically for your players. Maybe not so lovingly, but hopefully with their best interests at heart in terms of having a good time, at least, right? Speaking as a player myself, I really enjoy that sort of break from the big open, the world is your oyster type of thing, and having now this very, again, focused, encounter-based, really kind of adventurous little space. And sometimes that can last for several hours. Sometimes it could be a very quick one, just an hour. Sometimes it could be several sessions, a big mega dungeon of some kind. So it's something to think about. How can you use dungeons in your game to achieve certain things? And sometimes maybe it could be a break from that big open sandbox. Now that's not to say you don't have choices in your dungeons. Certainly, I think it's great to have choices and allow for player creativity and even encourage it. There might be certain obstacles that you don't have a solution in mind to, but you can trust in your players' creativity to figure out. A lot of times it is good to have maybe a few different solutions in mind, and then sometimes, I find very often actually, your players will surprise you and pick a 4th or 5th solution that you didn't think of. And so that's all really great too. So it's good to, even though it is a very focused thing, allow for maybe branching paths, that's one thing, or certain obstacles where players have to be creative to try to overcome them. So we talked about the fact that a dungeon is not always an underground prison, but I want to expand your horizons even more. Not only is it not an underground prison, it's not necessarily ruins or a temple or an abandoned factory, or whatever it might be. It also could be a structure, not necessarily a place. So that's something to think about. How can a dungeon be a structure? Well, you're out in the woods and you have sort of these specific encounters that are acting sort of like rooms. I got a lot of my ideas for this from Matt from A Fistful of Dice. He's got a really great video that I'm going to link down in the description below. Just hit that little show more button and you'll see all the things I'm referring to here. But he's got a video, Dungeon Building 101, where he talks about the 5-room dungeon. Really cool idea for how you can build dungeons sort of structurally. And his video works really well if you're playing Theater of the Mind especially, but it absolutely can work for playing with maps and minis as well. So to sum up that idea, a dungeon might not be a specific place, it might be a series of encounters. A dungeon is sort of a flow chart. It is something that has choices and branching paths, but it is still somewhat contained. So now that we've talked a little bit about what a dungeon is, let's get a little more specific now and actually plan out a given dungeon. Now, there's a few different resources that I suggest using. I'm going to put links to these all in the description below, and I definitely recommend you check them out. Firstly, I have the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D 5th edition. Really great tool, and I'll be referring to this as we go throughout the process. Secondly, one of my favorite books, even though I don't play Pathfinder anymore, this is a really good book for any fantasy role-playing game, and it is the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide. Highly recommend this one. Great tool for all kinds of role-playing game purposes. Lastly, there's a book that I actually had a part in, and it is an absolute tabletop book called Be a Better Campaign Master, Part 1, Building the World. And there's a section that has some roll tables for dungeons and fortresses and things like that. So, check out this book over on absolutetabletop.com. So, as you can see, there are lots of great resources out there for you to use for creating dungeons, but it can still be kind of hard to know where exactly to start, even if you're using one of these resources. So I'm going to give you a few big questions to ask, and hopefully answering these questions can help guide you into what kind of dungeon you want to make. So the first question is, who created this dungeon? Who created this place? Now, maybe no one really created this dungeon. Maybe it's a natural formation of some kind. You know, a natural series of caverns, or something that was created by a cataclysmic event of some kind, or that was created unintentionally. The second question you want to ask, especially if someone intentionally created it, is what was its purpose? Why did they create it? What was it there for? And thirdly, we should ask, what is the history of this dungeon? Is it still being used by its original creator, or has it been repurposed now and is in use by someone else? Is it completely abandoned? What is the history of this place? Now, those questions aren't necessarily meant to be answered in order. Who created it might not be even known by you yet. Maybe you just have a cool idea for a dungeon, a specific location that your players stumble upon, and maybe that's up to you to now figure out later who created it and what its purpose was. But you just have a cool idea for a place. And that can be fine, but you probably do eventually want to think, okay, who created this? Because that can make for a really engaging and interesting story. On the other hand, who created it might be the main thing you want to answer. You might say that, well, a group of sorcerers used this location to try to open up a planar gate, right? And in that case, you know who created it and what for, and then you can turn to some of these resources, or you can just brainstorm some ideas and try to figure out, okay, but what is it? Is it a sunken ship? Is it a ruined castle? Is it a natural cave structure? There are all sorts of options there. So for the purpose of creating a dungeon with you all here and now, I was inspired by the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide by one particular idea that just really stood out to me. Firstly, I have not really created many dungeons that are natural series of caves. Most of the dungeons I've created are a little bit of a mix, but often mostly man-made structures. I decided I wanted to do some kind of natural formation, and I was struck by this example in here in the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide. This is on page 178 under Types of Dungeons, and that is incredibly narrow limestone gorges. I've always loved the idea of hiking in places like this, and it just sounded like a really cool idea, these limestone gorges. Lots of opportunities for interesting encounters there, and probably lots of wild beasts of all kinds as well. So, should be fun. So that's what I know I want to do. That jumped out, and then I had to think, okay, who did create this? Is it really natural? And I thought, what if it isn't really natural? What if this was created by stone giants of the past who actually created these narrow gorges in mining? They had these veins of maybe precious metal that were running through this limestone, and so they mined it out, and now what's left are these gorges. That could be a cool idea. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, the question of why would a group of adventurers be going here? Well, it could be random. It could just be traveling from A to B. They come across them. That could be cool. Or perhaps they're sent here on a quest. But either way, I'm going to save the question of who inhabits this place now, or what is its use now, for another time. Maybe for part 3 we'll do that, or maybe in part 2. So anyway, that's the basics that I am going to create right now. So I've got some ideas. I got some inspiration from the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide, and then I kind of took it and ran with it. And I was also inspired by the Dungeon Master's Guide, which does have some sections here on Dungeon Creator. It's got a section on cults and religious groups if you decide that a cult created it. If it's a group of humans or other humanoids, you could roll for NPC alignment or NPC class. Perhaps it's a group of rogues or sorcerers or warlocks. And the dungeon purpose. Is it a death trap, a lair, etc.? A maze, a tomb, a treasure vault? And the dungeon history. Abandoned by creators, abandoned due to plague, conquered by invaders, original creator still in control, or overrun by planar creatures. There are all sorts of options there. So this is a really good resource, this 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, for thinking about some of those questions. The Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide is just amazing. It's got a huge roll table, 50 items. It's a D100 roll table for types of dungeons. Also, they have one for places to find dungeons. And I'll just go through a couple of the examples here. And maybe if you're struggling to come up with your own ideas, some of these will inspire you. And certainly I recommend checking out these books for the whole list. So places to find a dungeon. Inside an ice flow, within a cathedral, in a cliffside village, inside a crashed space vessel. So yeah, you can even get sci-fi dungeons here, right? In a gigantic statue. Types of dungeons: a moving clockwork dungeon, an evil giant's castle, the massive skull of an ancient dragon, a colossal walking Iron Man. So all kinds of cool ideas here. Kind of reminds me of God of War. I mean, a huge part of, I can't remember which game it was, you were inside of a Titan. I think it was God of War 2. Anyway, lots of cool ideas here. Dungeon entrances: a well, a mine shaft, a snapping dragon turtle skull, a hole suddenly opens in the city streets, a tidal cave, etc. Dungeon rooms, mundane room characteristics, all sorts of great stuff in here. Dungeon dressing. Anyway, lots of great resources out there, and maybe some of those ideas I just mentioned inspired you. Let's also take a look at the Be a Better Campaign Master Book 1, which also has some great ideas in the adventuring locations. In adventuring locations, they have fortresses, ruins, caverns, and crypts, tombs, and dungeons. So just reading through again a couple examples for some of these. Crypts, tombs, and dungeons. This submerged dungeon is full of venomous crustaceans. Awesome. This dungeon was designed for torture. The sound of screams is magically dampened. Oof, twisted. This crypt is full of dwarven ghosts who make slave diggers of all who enter. If we go up to caverns here, the region's merchants guild works out of these caves. This grotto is the entrance to a large underwater kingdom. This cave is made from the salt of a nearby sea. Ironically, a tribe of sentient slugs lives here. Oh, that's so good. Let's go up to the ruins one. And again, these are all D100 charts, so you just roll for them, or you can pick your own. Ruins: nothing but large scattered stones remain of what was once a mighty royal memorial. This mighty memorial wall was destroyed by a malevolent force and still magically burns in effigy. Oof, awesome. If we go to the section here on fortresses, this fortress was built with multiple tunnels through a nearby mountain, useful for ambushes. Or, built into a hollowed hill, this fortress is nearly invisible to the naked eye on the forest floor. So anyway, lots of great inspiration out there. Again, maybe some of these ideas inspired you, or maybe this has inspired you to check out these great resources. So we're going to start wrapping things up here with this video, part 1, planning out your dungeon and just talking about what are dungeons even. And next time we're going to actually start putting pencil to paper and start mapping the dungeon out. We might get into what might inhabit this dungeon as well. That might kind of happen naturally as we are drawing it out. And it's going to be probably created kind of on the fly, and it should be a lot of fun. So make sure you come back for part 2 here in the next couple weeks. But thank you so much for joining me for part 1 here. If you liked this one, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I'd really appreciate it if you did. And yeah, I want to thank you again for joining me. Everybody take care, happy gaming, and you'll see me again very soon.